Hello students, today we want to look at exercise physiology. Now we're not going to be able to take a full look at all of the issues associated with exercise physiology, but we do want to just focus on a couple things that have relevance to you and the course you're studying at this moment, muscles, bones, and joints. So let's start by talking about energy demands and supply within the context of exercise. Well, once you begin to exercise, your cellular respiration increases because your body needs more energy. And we know the form or the currency of energy in the human body is ATP. So the minute you begin to exercise, your body has to increase its production of ATP. And to do that, it must now mobilize fuel inside of your body in form of fats and carbohydrates. It must mobilize oxygen to burn that fuel, to use local terminology. And finally, your body has to be able to remove the waste products of energy metabolism, carbon dioxide, water, H plus ions, and lactate. So that's why exercise poses a challenge to the human body. Now, at rest, almost 100% of our energy is produced by aerobic metabolism. What do we mean by aerobic metabolism? That's energy that's burnt with oxygen. Oxygen is used to oxidize the fuel in our body. As a result, blood lactate levels are low. And because we're at rest, our oxygen consumption is also low. But you can see on the diagram on the right that as soon as we start to exercise, the demand for ATP immediately goes up, and our body has to begin producing or finding ATP from nowhere. And actually, sometimes that demand actually occurs before exercise due to an anticipatory response. This might especially occur if exercise is associated with something highly significant, like the final of the 100 meters at the Olympics or a big game that an athlete is about to take part in. So, what are the three sources of energy that are utilized during exercise? Well, the first immediate source, sometimes called the phosphogen system, consists of stored ATP and phosphocreatine. We have a few molecules, a limited number of molecules of stored ATP within our muscle fibers. And that ATP can, of course, be broken down to ADP and organic phosphate, releasing energy. We also have a number of molecules of CP also within the muscle fibers. And they can donate a phosphate group to the ADP to produce more ATP. But that system is very, very limited. It activates immediately, but it peaks within about 5 seconds. And within 10 seconds, it's quickly depleted and fatigued. At best, if you're Usain Bolt, it will allow you to finish a 100-meter race. So we have to move on from our immediate term stores to what we call our short-term stores. And this now refers to the anaerobic energy system. Here we're going to use the glycolytic pathway and lactic acid. We know the glycolytic pathway activates when there's not enough oxygen present. And therefore this system is able to supply us with energy for a couple of minutes and allows us to tide things over until we can get enough oxygen being built up. It's the main source of energy after about 10 seconds, and it's going to peak within about 20 to 30 seconds. But by the end of a minute, that system is beginning to basically diminish. Lactic acid is beginning to build up, and at most it lasts 2 to 3 minutes. After this, we have to shift to a more long-term storage and usage of fuel, and that's when we utilize aerobic metabolism. And that aerobic metabolism is going to take over for most of the process of longer-term exercise, utilizing the Krebs cycle, whether the source of energy is going to be carbohydrates or fats. So we can summarize that during high-intensity short-term exercise, the first few seconds of ATP is produced by the phosphogen system, stored ATP and PC. After that, we have about 45 seconds to 2 minutes where we're using anaerobic glycolysis. But then after that, we have to switch to the aerobic system to procure ATP for our muscles. Now, at the beginning of exercise, oxygen uptake has to increase to meet the demands to produce ATP requirements. However, if we're utilizing or undergoing intense exercise, we may not actually have enough oxygen being delivered to our tissues to supply the ATP. And therefore, as we just saw, those initial few minutes, couple of minutes, occur in the absence of oxygen. Oxygen only reaches a steady state delivery maybe within 2 to 3 minutes of actually starting high intensity exercise. And so until that steady state is arrived, ATP requirements is met through anaerobic production and not aerobic production. And this creates, as you can see here on the diagram, a deficit. And we call this the oxygen deficit. During this time, the body is producing energy, but it's not utilizing oxygen. Now, because we have this oxygen deficit, after exercise, we have to repay that deficit. And so after exercise has ended, as you can see in this diagram here, there's still an increase in the use of oxygen by the body. And this deficit here is now repaid here. It's the difference between oxygen consumed during exercise and the amount that would have been consumed had aerobic metabolism been reached immediately. And we tend to refer to this as the excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, or EPOC. That's a complex word. It doesn't really roll off the tongue, but it's what's used by scientists today. The original term was oxygen debt, and it was described by the famous physiologist Hill. And he focused on the fact that oxygen was necessary to clear the buildup of lactate acid. But the reason we use the term EPOC in today's world is because we now recognize that oxygen isn't only used to clear lactate acid, but there are many other things that oxygen is utilized for after exercise. You can see these in the diagram on the right. After exercise, we have to resynthesize the PC in the muscle. We have to restore muscle and blood oxygen stores. There is an elevated body temperature that's going to increase the basal metabolic rate that requires more oxygen. Your heart rate and your breathing has increased, and that requires more oxygen. There are elevated hormones that are also causing an increased BMR, all needing more oxygen. And that's all in addition to the lactate conversion to glucose that requires oxygen. And that's why, even though the terms are sometimes used interchangeably, most modern exercise scientists prefer the term excess post-exercise oxygen consumption to oxygen debt. Now, the EPOC has two portions. The first portion occurs pretty quickly within the first few minutes after exercise. And that's called the alactic or the fast component. And during that time, we're synthesizing PC and we're replenishing the muscle and blood stores of oxygen. Like I said, that happens within 2 to 3 minutes. But the slow portion takes place over a much longer period of time. And some people even argue that it's elevated over 24 hours. This would include the things that we just mentioned, the elevated heart rate and breathing, the elevated body temperature, the elevated hormones, and the slow process of converting lactic acid to glucose. This is called the slow portion of the EPOC. Now this difference, or this EPOC, has been the subject of much publicity over the last few years with the advent of HIIT workouts. HIIT stands for high intensity interval training. And many popular magazines and television programs and videos on YouTube tout the claims of HIIT, that it can burn more energy and produce greater results than steady state cardio. And the thing that they point out is the fact that if you do 6 minutes of steady state cardio exercise, your EPOC is smaller than if you do the same period of high intensity interval training or any high intensity exercise. And you can see that that is actually true based on the diagrams here. The one in the left is a steady state, and you can see the epoch is a lot smaller than the epoch that occurs with high intensity exercise. So yes, there are benefits to HIIT training, but of course it's important to remember that if you're engaging in high intensity exercise, often you cannot maintain that level of exercise for the same length of time as you can maintain a steady state response. And so actually the HIIT workout, which has a greater epoch and therefore uses more calories in the short term, might not actually match, say, a steady state exercise program where you exercise for an hour. So there are many things to consider when you're determining which exercise you want to engage in. But it is a fact, as you can see from this graph, that a high intensity exercise produces a greater epoch than steady state exercises. The other thing we can see is that if you are somebody who has exercised over a period of time, and therefore you are now a trained athlete, what you notice is you have a lower oxygen deficit, as demonstrated by these green circles in the graph. And the reason for that is it seems that there are adaptations that take place in the body that allow you to better deliver oxygen to the tissues and also extract the oxygen to the tissues. Overall, that means you're not as dependent on anaerobic metabolism in the first part of intense exercise, and you also produce less lactic acid, and therefore your oxygen deficit at the beginning of exercise is lower. And that's one of the benefits of obviously training, exercise training over a period of time. And it's an example of the long-term adaptations that I was talking to you about right at the beginning. Okay, so we've just started to exercise and we've seen the immediate changes that take place. But as you continue to change, what are some of the things that happen? And what you can see from this graph is as we continue to exercise and as we continue to work, our oxygen utilization, the amount of oxygen that we're bringing into our body, continues to increase. And this will continue until we reach a maximum level where the oxygen utilization actually plateaus. This is called the VO2 max, and it's an important concept in exercise physiology because it's believed to be the ceiling at which maximum effort and maximum functionality can take place. Now, this VO2 max is different for different people, and it's affected by genetics and obviously your training. We can define it as the maximum ability of the cardiorespiratory system to deliver oxygen to the muscle tissue, and at the same time, the ability of the muscle tissue to utilize that oxygen and produce ATP. Now, to measure VO2 max properly, it's very, very complex. And there's a picture of someone in a lab where we're measuring all of the different parameters necessary to work out that you're actually at VO2 max. And the VO2 max is usually done in a lab like this because you really have to push the athlete to their limits. And therefore, you want to have all the necessary safety requirements considered and taken care of. And you also want to have all the necessary measurements being recorded, heart rate, respiratory rate, oxygen levels, etc., to ensure that we get an accurate reading. This graph just shows you that training does indeed increase the VO2 max, the amount of maximum uptake. You can see if you just take an average person who's not doing much exercise, and you compare them with two groups, one who undergoes 20 days bed rest and another who's had 50 days of training. The one who's undergone bed rest doing even less than the sedentary control, you can see their VO2 max has gone down. But the one who's undergone 50 days training, you can see there's a significant increase in their VO2 max. And this table here just highlights some values of VO2 max. Please note that VO2 max is measured in milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per minute. And for elite athletes, it's going to range from 65 to 75 in women and 75 to 85 in men. For the average young adult, it's approximately half of that, 40 to 45 in men, and 34 to 39 in women. Those gender differences have to do with, of course, the volume capacities of the lungs, which are different in men and women, and also the capacity of the heart in men and women. Another important measure that's used to assess exercise is the lactate threshold. Now, as you continue to exercise, lactate will appear in your blood because there'll be some level of anaerobic respiration taking place. Not much. But at a point, usually around 50 to 60% in an untrained subject, your body will suddenly shoot up, and the amount of lactic acid appearing in your blood suddenly increases. This used to be thought primarily due to the fact that you're now metabolizing your fuel anaerobically. But we know there are some other factors that are taking place here. For trained athletes, this will probably occur a little bit later than 60% of your VO2 max. The important point here is that this seems to represent an inflection point, or it represents a point of limitation in performance, because now your body begins to build up lactic acid, and this can induce fatigue and limit the successful performance of athletes. And notice it occurs before you reach 100% of your VO2 max. Possible things that are going on when the lactic threshold is reached is, one, you now have lower muscle oxygen because your muscles cannot extract the oxygen. So even though you're delivering the oxygen, the muscles haven't developed and the systems and capillaries haven't developed to extract the oxygen. And that's why this used to be referred to as the anaerobic threshold. But you also have other things that are taking place that we now believe increase the lactate in the system. This would include the recruitment of fast twitch muscle fibers, a reduced rate of lactate removal, and also accelerated glycolysis due to the increase in certain hormones. As mentioned, this lactate threshold is useful as a marker of training intensity. And one of the things athletes want to do is to progressively shift their lactate threshold to further along their VO2 max. That is shifted from, say, 50% of VO2 max to 60, 70% of VO2 max. And that will be done by training close to your maximum or at your lactate threshold and allowing the body to develop the adaptations to manage the changes taking place when this is occurring. Just remember that after exercise, all this excess lactic acid has to be removed. And one of the things that we've discovered now is the fact that light exercise can actually improve recovery, because light exercise stimulates blood flow in the tissues and in the muscles. And this increased blood flow helps us clear lactate in a much quicker way than just having no exercise at all. So sometimes after intense exercise, one of the things that it might be useful to do to clear lactic acid is just to walk a little bit and stretch a little bit and allow that light exercise to help clear your lactic acid. Okay, let's shift gears a little bit and let's talk a little bit about how is fuel utilized, not immediately when you start to exercise, because we saw that, but as we go longer and we shift into aerobic metabolism. And to do that, we want to focus on something called the respiratory exchange ratio. Now, this is the ratio of carbon dioxide produced to the amount of oxygen consumed. Now, this is a measure that occurs when the person has reached steady state. And it's a value that tells us what particular fuel is being burned. Now, if you look at this equation, many of you might not have seen equations like this for a long time since your days of chemistry. But basically, this tells you that R, the respiratory exchange quotient, is the amount of carbon dioxide produced over the amount of oxygen utilized. And if you look at that for a fat, what you find is for every 23 atoms of oxygen utilized, you get 16 carbon dioxide produced. And that gives you a ratio of 0.7. But for a carbohydrate like glucose, the ratio is actually 1, 6 over 6. And that's a general principle that holds. If you are utilizing and burning fats only, then your ratio is 100%, sorry, then your R value is 0.7. So if you see an R value of 0.7, that means you're only burning fats. But if you see an R value of 1, that means you're only burning carbohydrates. If you see an R value of 0.9, and you can go back and look at the table on the previous slide, that means 67 or 2/3 of your fuel is coming from carbohydrates, and approximately 1/3 of your fuel is coming from fat sources. And so the R value gives us an idea of what particular fuel is being burned in the body. Now, this is important because at different exercise intensities, we tend to use different fuels. So you can see from this graph that if you're exercising at a low intensity, say 20–30% of your VO2 max, most of your fuel is coming from fats, which are labeled in red here. A lot less is coming from carbohydrates. However, when you shift to higher intensity exercise, say 80%, now you see most of your fuel is coming from carbohydrates and much less is coming from fat sources. And this shift in source of fuel as you increase your exercise intensity is described as a crossover concept. And it's believed to be due to the fact that you start utilizing fast twitch muscles in higher intensity exercise. And as you know, they use glycolytic processes that depend on carbohydrates. And also the increased levels of blood epinephrine and blood adrenaline. And that triggers these same responses that lead to the mobilization of carbohydrates as opposed to fats. So there's that crossover concept again. The fact that at low intensity exercise, we tend to predominantly use fats. And at high intensity exercise, we tend to predominantly use carbohydrates. Now, this has led again to one of these things that you see around gyms. The fact that they'll tell you that if you want to burn more fat, exercise at a low intensity. And to some extent, what we just saw is that's true, because when you're utilizing low intensity exercise, most of the fuel is fat. However, it's important to remember that in order to consider things like weight loss or the amount of calories burned, you can't just only consider the fuel that you're utilizing, but you also have to consider what's the intensity of the exercise and overall how many calories are being burnt by the exercise. So you can have a low intensity exercise that's predominantly using fats, as you can see here, but it's not burning many calories. So ultimately, you're not actually burning a lot of fat. Or you can be exercising with a lot higher intensity, a lot higher intensity. And it's using a lot less fat, as you can see here. But overall, the number of calories being consumed is a lot higher. And it actually then means you're actually burning more fat than if you were operating at a low intensity exercise. So that's just something to think about and something to remember. In order to understand exactly what you want to achieve with your exercise, you don't have to just think about the fuel that you're utilizing, but you also have to be aware of your overall energy expenditure. Well, what about fuel usage, not just based on intensity of exercise, but based upon duration of exercise? And here we have a slightly different shift. When we start to exercise for longer than 30 minutes, what happens is your body starts to utilize more fat than carbohydrate. There's an increase in the rate of lipolysis and the breakdown of your triglycerides to give glycerol and free fatty acids. And that's again stimulated by adrenaline and the different hormones in the body. So the longer you exercise, the more you're going to be dependent upon certain levels of fat within your body. And this has led to the concept of fats burn in the flame of carbohydrates. That it's only after you've depleted your carbohydrate stores in your body that you actually then begin to utilize the fat stores in your body, especially with high intensity exercise. And so this has led some people to suggest that you need to exercise for at least 30 minutes to actually start burning those fats. As we've seen, that's not true because at low intensity exercise, you'll be burning fats before that. But it does mean that there is a shift that the body does undergo. And that if you want to start primarily using fats as your fuel, you do have to get rid of all the glucose that's in your body and the glycogen. And then your body is able to activate activate and utilize more fat. Now, the disadvantage of this is the process of oxidizing fat in the body actually takes a little longer than the process of oxidating carbohydrates. And therefore, when you make this transition, your body can start to feel sluggish. And in running, that's often called hitting the wall, or endurance races like cycling. The depletion of muscle and blood carbohydrates can begin to make you to feel fatigued. And that inability to get the energy you need quickly enough can actually slow you down or even make you stop the race. And therefore, in order to overcome that in a long distance race, what you need to be doing is you need to be taking in carbohydrates. And that ensures that your carbohydrate levels don't fall too low. And some people suggest you should be taking 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour if you're doing long endurance races like a marathon or a triathlon. Some people have even suggested that if you're doing shorter races but they're very high intensity and you're going to deplete your glycogen stores, then you should also find a way to take in carbohydrates. And so this graph just shows you that as exercise increases and time goes on, the percent of energy expenditure that's coming from glycogen, from your free fatty acids and your muscle triglycerides and blood glucose. And this graph here shows you, based on the intensity of the exercise, how much is coming from the different fuel sources. Again, things we've mentioned already: high intensity exercise, pulling a lot from your carbohydrates; low intensity exercise, pulling a lot from your free fatty acids in the plasma, and in between, using a combination of both. That's the crossover concept that we were talking about before. So in summary, the actual fuel selection during exercise is affected by many things, and you need to be aware of that. It includes your diet, it includes your intensity of your workout, and it's going to include the duration of your workout. You need to find out what's best for you to meet your particular goals. Carbohydrates are the major fuel for high intensity exercise. Fats are the major fuel for prolonged exercise and lower intensity exercise. Generally, proteins don't have a large role to play unless we're talking about very, very long duration. We're talking like greater than 3 hours. Okay, so you can take a pause now in the video if you wish. Take a little break, relax your brain, stretch a little bit. We're going to go on to look at what are some of the cardiovascular changes that take place during exercise. Now, the basic principle we said at the beginning is that in order to match the increase in cellular respiration, we have to supply more oxygen to the body to burn the fuels of the body. And that basically means two things have to occur. One, there's an increase in cardiac output. And two, we want to get more of the blood flowing to the muscles where it's needed than other organs in the body where it's not as relevant at this particular time. And this figure here just summarizes all the things that we're going to talk about in a little while. How do we increase cardiac output? And how do we shift more blood flow to the skeletal muscles? So let's start by talking about cardiac output. Well, let me begin by reminding you that cardiac output, Q, is equal to your heart rate by your stroke volume. And as you can see from this graph here, that cardiac output generally increases in a fairly linear way as intensity of exercise increases. And you can change your cardiac output from the normal 5 liters per minute to as much as 30 to 35 liters per minute, which is quite significant during exercise. And to do that, we increase both the heart rate and the stroke volume. And we're going to talk about stroke volume first. We can see here in this diagram that stroke volume will increase as exercise intensity increases. And then it will begin to plateau at about 40 to 60% of VO2 max. So as exercise intensity increases, so does stroke volume. And the reason for this is because also as stroke volume is increasing, heart rate is increasing. And we know once heart rate is increasing, the ventricular filling time is decreasing. Remember, if heart rate gets quicker, ventricular filling time has to slow down. Okay. Now, ventricular filling time is important because you know that if you stretch the muscles of the ventricles, because there's more blood, it increases the force of contraction, and that leads to a greater stroke volume. So as you stretch the muscles of the ventricles due to more filling, then you're able to force more blood out and increase stroke volume. But if the heart is beating faster, there's less time to fill. And that's why stroke volume reaches this maximum. Now, elite athletes are often able to go beyond 60%, some of them. Once exercise intensity increases above 60% though, the cardiac output will continue to increase, but now it's primarily due to the fact that stroke volume has plateaued, but the heart rate is increasing. Now, this gives rise to an important concept, that's called the ejection fraction. Now, the ejection fraction is your stroke volume over your end diastolic volume. It's a measure of what proportion of your end diastolic volume is actually being ejected. Okay? And we just explained what are the principles behind that, reminding you of the Frank-Starling law of the heart. And this diagram here from Penn just tells you the different values of ejection fraction. Athletes might have high functioning hearts with an ejection fraction of greater than 70%. And that's because their hearts usually have developed and they have a greater stroke volume to begin with, and their heart rates are lower. Most of us have a normal functioning stroke volume somewhere between 55, 50, and 70%. If you're between 40 and 55%, that would be considered low functioning or borderline. Something is going on there and it needs to be checked out. Cardiomyopathy, scarring for some reason in your heart. And then finally, if you're below 40%, that means you could possibly be in heart failure down at this part of the curve. And you'll be needed to give some drug to shift you back to normal, to strengthen those contractions, to prevent congestive cardiac failure occurring and a backup occurring inside of the inside of the venous system of your body. Things that increase contractility are catecholamines, which are increased in exercise, and drugs like digoxin. Things that decrease contractility are beta blockers or dilated cardiomyopathy, when you have a problem with the wall, there's a problem with the muscles in the walls, and certain calcium channel blockers. So we've seen that stroke volumes increases to a maximum, but the heart rate will keep increasing until you reach close to your VO2 max. And it can actually lead to a heart rate that can be up to 2 or 3 times greater than your resting value. Now, one of the things you can do right now is actually determine your resting heart rate. I know you enjoy my lectures and they're full of energy and full of enthusiasm, but I suspect overall your heart rate is fairly calm at the moment and it's not elevated. So you can actually just put your fingers on your pulse and count for 30 seconds what your heart rate is. Remember, heart rate is per minute, so remember to take that value over 30 seconds and multiply it by 2. And that will give you your resting heart rate. Most of us have a resting heart rate somewhere around 70 beats per minute. Some of us have higher. If you're into sports and physical activity, that'll bring your heart rate down maybe to around 60 or 50 beats per minute. Now, this is important because it's used to determine exercise intensity. Remember, we can't measure VO2 max very easily. So one of the ways we determine exercise intensity is by using heart rate. Now, to do that, we need to establish a couple of baseline parameters. And the first baseline parameter that we identified was your resting heart rate. The second parameter that we need to identify is what's your maximum heart rate. And research suggests that our maximum heart rate is 220 minus your age. So if you are 40 years old and you're listening to me, your maximum heart rate should be around 180. If you're 20 years old, and I suspect most of you are in that age range, then your maximum heart rate is around 220. So once you've determined your maximum heart rate, then to determine your exercise intensity, you just take whatever percentage of your maximum heart rate. So if you want to exercise at 50% of your maximum and you're 20 years old, your max again is 220 minus 20, which is 200. And then 50% of 200 is 100. And that should be the target heart rate that you should be trying to maintain during your exercise. And to do that, you'll need a heart rate monitor to give you feedback as your exercise is changing and try to keep you at that intensity level. So here we have a simple example, and good students should be able to work out these examples of someone who wants to work at 65% intensity and they're 20 years old. And you can see the maths again. Predicted maximum heart rate is 200. That's 220 minus 20. 200 times 65% gives you a value of 130 beats per minute, and that's your training heart rate. Now, this is a useful formula, but it does not take into account cardiovascular fitness. And cardiovascular fitness means that if you have been exercising and your heart has undergone long-term adaptation, it can endure higher heart rates and allow you to function better than other people. So in order to do that, another formula is used, and that's a Carnot-Venn formula. And to utilize a Carnot-Venn formula, they make use of something called the heart rate reserve. So the heart rate reserve is the difference between your resting heart rate and your maximum heart rate. So let's keep this simple. Let's imagine you're 20 years old. And let's imagine your resting heart rate is 60. Well, your maximum heart rate will be 220 minus 20. That's 200. Your resting heart rate will be 200 minus 60. That gives you a heart rate reserve of 140. Now you take that heart rate reserve and you plug it into the Carnot-Venn formula here. Maximum heart rate minus resting heart rate. And you multiply that by your training intensity. So let's imagine that now you want to train at 50%. So remember, our heart rate reserve was 140. So 140 by 50% is 70. And then to get your target heart rate, you add that to your resting heart rate. That's 70 plus 60, that's 130. Now you can play back the video to understand it. You can look at the formula and just pause and study it. Or we have an example here on the next page that you can just look at and consider and learn how to use the Carnot-Venn formula to calculate heart rate. What you'll realize when you do that is persons who have a lower heart rate, they're more fit, and it allows them to train at a higher intensity than those who did not have the heart rate, lower heart rate. And this graph, sorry, not graph, this table just shows you then how heart rate and stroke volume change between males and females, and those who have been trained and those who are not trained. And what you'll notice significantly is that trained athletes have lower heart rates. There's not much difference in the max, but the trained athletes have the ability to have a much greater stroke volume because there are adaptations that have taken place in their heart muscles. And that, of course, leads to a much greater cardiac output, which allows them to perform more or perform better during exercise. Okay, so we've looked at how the body increases the amount of blood leaving the heart and going to the tissues. But we said there's something else that happens. There's a change in the distribution of blood throughout the body. And as you can see here, that as we exercise, the amount of blood going towards the skeletal muscles increases significantly. The amount of blood going to the gut decreases. And that's summarized in these two charts here, these two figures here. You can see that the amount of, or percent of blood going to the skeletal muscles goes from about 20% to about 90% during vigorous exercise. Whereas the percent of blood going to all those other organs that are not really needed so much during exercise, but must be kept functioning and alive, they decrease significantly. The kidneys from 20% to 4%. The gastrointestinal system from 25% approximately to 1%. Skin and other tissues from 10% to about 3%. The brain goes from 13% to 3%. Now, one thing I just want to point out is that the proportion changes, but sometimes the actual volume might actually show an increase or stay the same. And that's especially important for the brain. The brain actually stays the same. So even though the proportion is decreased, it's still getting enough blood to function, because we know the brain is very important in exercise, especially competitive exercise. So what's responsible for this distribution change? Well, this is primarily driven by local factors in a process called autoregulation. Once exercise occurs, there's a release of several things like nitric oxide and prostaglandins and different factors, and they basically dilate the blood vessels, decreasing peripheral resistance, and therefore causing more blood to flow to the skeletal muscles. Whereas in other parts of the body, there's not this thing taking place with the peripheral resistance decreasing. Those vessels don't dilate, and therefore blood does not flow there. This is something peculiar to the skeletal muscles especially. And over time, there's an increase in the uptake of oxygen by the skeletal muscles. So the arteriovenous difference, the amount of oxygen in the arterial system versus the venous system changes. At rest, it's about 25%, meaning there's only about a 25% extraction, whereas at peak exercise, it's 85%. There's a lot less oxygen in the venous system than the arterial system, because the blood, the oxygen is being extracted by your skeletal muscles. Last two things I just want to mention about the cardiovascular system. Blood pressure will increase during exercise. That's primarily due to the fact that your systolic is increasing, not your diastolic. And finally, the AVO2 difference. That's the difference in the oxygen content between the arterial and the venous blood. And I just mentioned that to you, and you can see how it increases as the intensity of exercise increases. And this is something that should be measured and tracked. Now let's just look briefly at prolonged exercise. This is exercise now where you're going a little bit beyond 15, 20 minutes, you're 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 90 minutes. What you find during prolonged exercise is that we must maintain cardiac output, and we can see that with that graph there. But once you cross about 30 minutes, there starts to be a slow decrease in stroke volume. And to maintain cardiac output, we have to have this increase in heart rate that we're talking about. And the reasons for that are couplefold. We call this cardiovascular drift, where there's a slow increase in heart rate to compensate for the decrease in stroke volume. And there are a number of things going on. There's dehydration. You're losing water due to sweating. There's increased blood flow to the skin, because as your body temperature rises, you have to cool the body. There's a shift of some blood plasma to the interstitium. All of these things are leading to a hemoconcentration and an increase in blood viscosity. And all of these things are decreasing the stroke volume and now requiring you to increase your heart rate. And all of these things are why it is very, very important if during prolonged exercise, you don't want this hemoconcentration taking place. You don't want increases in blood viscosity. You're losing fluids that you replenish your fluids. Very, very important for athletes who are, or not just athletes, persons who are undergoing prolonged exercise. Okay, so those were our cardiovascular changes. Let's now look at our respiratory changes. This will be fairly brief. The respiratory system, as we know, brings the oxygen to the body, and it has to remove the carbon dioxide. But it also plays a role in acid-base balance. We're not going to look at that, but it's something that you should be aware of. Remember, I said there are many aspects to exercise physiology. We're just looking at a couple. And the thing we want to note is that once exercise starts, there's an immediate increase in respiration. Immediate. And your respiration can move from averaging 6 liters per minute to almost 175 liters per minute at peak exercise. That's because your respiratory rate increases from 12 to 18 to as much as 45 to 60 breaths per minute. And your tidal volume can increase from 500 ml to over 2 liters per minute. All of this is designed to ensure that you maintain partial pressures of oxygen and partial pressures of carbon dioxide. And you can see right after exercise, there's this little dip in oxygen, this little increase in carbon dioxide, but that's quickly adjusted and compensated for by an increase in respiration. Now, when we're thinking about respiration, your ventilation rate will increase and the amount of oxygen that's taken up until you reach about 50 to 70% of your VO2 max. After that, you'll see there's a sudden exponential increase. And when it suddenly get this sudden exponential increase, that's called a ventilatory threshold. It's a point at which there's a sudden increase in carbon dioxide that's not lining up with the amount of oxygen you're consuming. Your body's now producing too much carbon dioxide and you cannot clear it quickly enough. So you start to breathe a lot faster. And this often corresponds to the lactate threshold. And this often is something that you need to be aware of if you're an athlete. So you can see that for the untrained athlete, the ventilatory threshold will occur at a lower percent of your work rate, your VO2 max, than for your trained athlete. That's something to be aware of. Okay? You can see that the pH is telling us about the levels of carbon dioxide. That as the carbon dioxide suddenly starts to build up, your pH drops and your respiratory rate goes up. But for the trained athlete, that buildup of carbon dioxide is a lot slower, so the pH is dropping a lot slower. And therefore, you get your ventilatory breakpoint or ventilatory threshold a lot later than for the untrained athlete. So one of the things that happens as you train your body is that your body becomes a lot better at extracting oxygen. So you can work harder and breathe less. So let's just use this example here at 160. This is you before training, and you're having to extract up to 60 liters per minute. But after training, you can see for work of 160 watts, you can deal with 50. And that's part of what happens in training, your ability to extract the oxygen and utilize the oxygen, and therefore produce lower blood lactic acid occurs. And this is something that's important that takes place as you train. So do the lungs limit performance? Actually not. If it's the first time you're exercising, you might feel your lungs burning, but generally the delivery of oxygen to the body via lungs is not seen as a limitation in submaximal exercise and also in maximum healthy exercise. If you are an endurance athlete doing these triathlons, like an Ironman that's lasting several hours, 10, 12 hours, it may then be that you aren't able to get enough oxygen to your body because your body has been trained and it can maximally extract oxygen, and therefore the delivery of oxygen becomes a limiting factor. But for most of us, that is not the case. So that brings us to the end of our quick review of some of the important considerations inside of exercise physiology. We said at the beginning that exercise physiology really looks at the changes that are taking place in the body as we utilize more energy in order to exercise. And we've focused on three things. The changes in fuel utilization during exercise, the cardiovascular changes during exercise, and the respiratory changes during exercise we looked at briefly. We've primarily focused on the changes that actually take place acutely during exercise, but we did mention some of the chronic changes. And it's important that you do some more research and you go and understand what are the chronic changes in your body in response to exercise. Hope you found this useful, and I hope you enjoyed our lecture today.